The sheriff's cruiser rolled up my gravel driveway at 6 a.m., lights flashing, all because some HOA Karen called 911 over me splitting firewood on my own mountain land. I stepped outside in boots and flannel, chainsaw still warm in my hand. Deputy Rodriguez was already shaking his head like he knew this was bullshit. Right there in my driveway sat Brenda Hightower in her gleaming white BMW, parked blocking the way, designer sunglasses on, arms crossed, glaring up at my cabin like it personally offended her. She'd moved into the valley 6 months ago and instantly started treating lifelong locals like me as trash, ruining her perfect view. What she didn't know? I don't just own this cabin. I quietly own every single acre around here, including the land her new house sits on. That one phone call was about to destroy everything she came here for. Drop your wildest HOA nightmare in the comments. Let's see who's dealt with worse than this. Let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this mountain paradise in the first place. My name's Marcus Thornfield. Friends call me Mac. And 3 years ago, I was just another burned-out Air Force logistics officer looking for somewhere quiet to heal after burying my wife, Sarah. Cancer took her at 51. 23 years of marriage, gone in 8 months of chemo and hospital rooms that reeked of industrial disinfectant and crushed hope. The life insurance payout was decent, and Sarah had always dreamed of a mountain cabin where she could paint watercolors of sunrise over pine trees. Whispering Pines Valley caught my eye in a Craigslist ad. 40 acres for $180,000 cash, seller motivated. I bought it sight unseen because the photos showed exactly what Sarah would have loved. Nothing but wilderness stretching to the horizon, and a creek so clear you could count pebbles on the bottom. I spent the next year building our dream cabin with my own hands. 1,200 square feet of lodgepole pine and stone, solar panels gleaming on the roof like technological prayer flags. Every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, I'd fire up my chainsaw to split firewood, letting the sharp crack of splitting oak echo off granite cliffs, while the scent of sawdust mixed with mountain coffee. The valley itself held maybe 40 homes, scattered across 200 acres of pure mountain paradise. Most neighbors were like me, veterans, retirees, artists, people who'd traded corporate stress for the simple pleasure of chopping your own firewood and knowing every star in an unpolluted sky. Then, the invasion began. 18 months ago, Derek Hightower started building Pines Vista Estates, 12 McMansions crammed onto land that should have held 4 decent cabins. Each house cost more than a Ferrari, designed for tech executives who wanted mountain views without mountain living. Derek's wife, Brenda, was the crown jewel of entitlement. Picture a suburban soccer mom who'd watched one too many HGTV shows and decided she was qualified to redesign God's creation. Silver hair shellacked into helmet perfection, designer hiking boots that had never touched actual dirt, and an attitude that could make a grizzly bear apologize for existing. Their $850,000 glass monument to suburban anxiety stuck out like a space station among our log cabins. Where we had stone chimneys breathing wood smoke into crisp morning air, they had steel and glass reflecting sunlight like some kind of architectural middle finger pointed at the mountains. Within 6 months, Brenda had militarized the valley's first ever HOA with herself as supreme commander. Her opening salvo targeted Walt Kowalski's vintage Chevy. Apparently, a 1987 pickup truck was diminishing the aesthetic integrity of our mountain community. Yes, next came Elena Santos's tomato garden, which Brenda declared inappropriately agricultural for a residential setting. But I was her white whale. My property sat at the valley's highest point, visible from every fancy window below. Every morning when I split wood, every afternoon when I ran my furniture shop, every weekend when I took my ATV for a trail ride, Brenda could see me through her floor-to-ceiling windows living exactly the life she'd moved here to escape. The harassment started small. Anonymous complaints to the county about excessive noise during early hours and unsightly storage structures. Then came the certified letter demanding $500 daily fines for violating community standards I'd never agreed to follow. I pulled my deed and laughed out loud. Bought my land in 2021, 2 full years before any HOA existed. Legally speaking, Brenda had about as much authority over my property as she did over the moon. When I called to explain this politely, her mask slipped completely. "Listen here, you backwoods redneck. We're going to civilize this place whether you like it or not." That's when I realized this wasn't about noise ordinances or property values. This was war, and Brenda Hightower had just made the biggest tactical error of her privileged life. 2 weeks after our charming phone conversation, Brenda launched her first official attack. A FedEx truck rumbled up my gravel driveway, diesel exhaust mixing with morning pine scent, carrying a thick envelope that felt heavy with expensive trouble. Kensington & Associates, attorneys at law. One of those $400 an hour San Francisco firms that charge more per hour than most folks make in a week. The return address alone was designed to make regular people wet themselves. The cease and desist letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. 3 pages of fancy letterhead claiming my ongoing nuisance activities were causing irreparable harm to property values and residential tranquility. They threatened a lawsuit for damages exceeding $50,000 unless I immediately stopped all commercial woodworking operations, excessive noise generation, and unsightly storage of materials. Attached were 47 photographs of my property taken with what must have been a telephoto lens, my woodshed, my solar panels, even my damn mailbox, all labeled as aesthetic violations, like I was running a meth lab instead of making custom furniture. I poured myself coffee strong enough to wake the dead and read through their demands again. These city lawyers had clearly never tangled with a military logistics officer who'd spent 20 years dealing with Pentagon bureaucrats and calling out colonels when they were full of shit. Time for some research. The county law library smelled like old books and frustrated citizens, fluorescent lights humming overhead as I dove into Colorado agricultural law. 3 days later, I'd found my ammunition. Back in my Air Force days, I'd learned that every problem has a regulation somewhere, and every regulation has an exception if you know where to look. Turns out Colorado's right to farm statute protects agricultural activities that predate residential development. Custom furniture making from locally sourced timber? Definitely agricultural processing. Brenda's fancy lawyers had just threatened a guy whose woodworking business was more legally protected than a bald eagle's nest. I drafted my response on letterhead I designed myself. Thornfield Mountain Enterprises, LLC. 1 page, plain English, explaining that my activities were protected under state agricultural statutes and suggesting Kensington & Associates might want to research rural property rights before embarrassing themselves in court. But that's when things got really interesting. While I was playing legal chess, my neighbors, Walt Kowalski and Elena Santos, appeared on my porch with coffee and intel. Walt, 78 years old and weathered like granite, had been watching Brenda's operation with the sharp eyes of an old logger who'd seen plenty of schemes in his time. "That woman's been mighty busy," he said, settling into my porch rocker with a grunt. The morning air carried the distant sound of Brenda's BMW purring down valley roads like a predator on patrol. "Taking pictures of everybody's property, not just yours. Been asking real specific questions about who owns what." Elena nodded, her work-roughened hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "Derek showed up at my place last week with a folder full of paperwork, offered me $50,000 over market value, cash, no inspection needed, said he was helping longtime residents maximize their investment potential." My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. "How many others has he approached?" "At least 6 that I know of," Elena said. "Always the same pitch. Cash offers way above asking price, quick closings, no questions asked." Walt leaned forward, his logger's instincts sharp as a crosscut saw. "Been watching them at night, too. Derek's been prowling around with surveying equipment after dark. Saw him twice this week with a GPS unit and clipboard, walking property lines like he was planning something." That's when the real picture snapped into focus like a rifle scope finding its target. This wasn't about my chainsaw or Elena's tomato garden. Brenda and Derek were systematically cataloging every property in the valley, making strategic cash offers, using legal threats to pressure holdouts. The harassment wasn't personal, it was business reconnaissance. I installed my first trail camera that evening, a cellular model I'd researched online. 20 years of military procurement had taught me that the best surveillance gear doesn't come from government contractors. It comes from hunters who need to catch poachers. For under $200, I could monitor my entire property line and get real-time photos sent to my phone. The next morning brought Brenda's escalation. A county inspector knocked on my door with a clipboard and a bad attitude, claiming my woodworking violated home business permits. The citation threatened a $5,000 fine if I couldn't produce proper documentation within 48 hours. most folks would have panicked. Lucky for me, 2 decades of Air Force logistics had taught me that paperwork problems always have paperwork solutions. I spent the afternoon at the county office obtaining every permit my operation might conceivably need. Business license, fire safety compliance, environmental impact waiver, even a cottage industry certification that probably wasn't required but looked official as hell. By Friday, my little woodworking shop was more legally bulletproof than a government contract. But Brenda had made a critical error. She'd underestimated mountain folks' solidarity. Word spread through our valley faster than wildfire in August drought. Elena organized coffee meetings where neighbors compared their derrick encounter stories. Walt started logging every suspicious vehicle that entered our valley. And me? I kept splitting wood every morning at 7 a.m. sharp, my chainsaw announcing dawn like a mechanical rooster. The sweet scent of fresh oak shavings drifted across the valley as I stacked cord after cord, perfectly visible from Brenda's floor-to-ceiling windows. Let her document whatever she wanted. I was just getting started. Brenda's next move came disguised as concerned citizenship. Over the next 2 weeks, the county fire marshal showed up to investigate anonymous reports about improper wood storage. The environmental agency sent an inspector after someone claimed I was illegally dumping sawdust into the creek. Even the Postal Service got involved when multiple concerned citizens complained about my mailbox being insufficiently visible from the roadway. Each visit meant the same apologetic shrug from county employees who clearly knew they were being weaponized by someone with too much time and too little sense. The fire marshal actually complimented my wood storage setup before grudgingly writing "no violations found" on his clipboard. But the really creative harassment started when my equipment began mysteriously malfunctioning. First, my chainsaw developed what mechanics call sugar in the gas tank, a classic sabotage technique that turns your fuel system into expensive scrap metal. The repair shop in town shook their heads when they saw the crystallized mess clogging my carburetor. "Seen this before," the mechanic said, wiping his hands on an oily rag. "Usually happens to folks who piss off the wrong neighbors." Then my ATV tires got slashed while it sat parked behind my cabin. Not just punctured. Professionally cut with something razor sharp, all 4 tires ruined in perfectly straight lines. The acrid smell of rubber and betrayed trust hung in the mountain air as I stared at $800 worth of deliberate destruction. That's when I decided to upgrade my security game. My old trail cameras had been doing their job, but I needed better coverage. A quick online search led me to a cellular surveillance system that hunters use to catch poachers, motion-activated cameras that upload photos instantly to a secure server. The setup cost me $600, but it covered every approach to my property with military-grade precision. 2 days later, I got my money's worth. At 2:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected at camera 3. The image showed a figure in dark clothing and a baseball cap skulking near my shed with what looked like a Slim Jim and a small crowbar. The intruder's face was hidden, but the body language screamed guilty conscience. I slipped on boots and grabbed my flashlight, moving through the darkness with the silent efficiency the Air Force had drilled into me during night exercises. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth as I approached my shed, pine needles crunching softly underfoot. The intruder was gone, but they'd left evidence. Pry marks on my shed door and a small pile of metal shavings where someone had tried to force the lock. They'd also spilled gasoline from a container they'd apparently dropped when my motion lights triggered. The sharp chemical smell mixed with mountain air told the whole story. Someone had planned to destroy more than just tires. By morning, my phone held 3 more photos. The same figure retreating toward the road, climbing into what looked suspiciously like a white Tesla Model S, and the license plate clear as day in my infrared camera's final shot. Derek Hightower's license plate. The community response was swift and furious. Elena organized what she diplomatically called a neighborhood watch meeting, but what actually resembled a war council of pissed-off mountain folks. 12 neighbors gathered in Walt's living room, the air thick with coffee steam and righteous anger. "This has gone way beyond property disputes," said Jim Murphy, a retired surveyor who'd lived in the valley for 30 years. "Breaking and entering vandalism. That's criminal behavior." Walt nodded grimly, his old hands steady as granite. "Been watching the Hightowers real close since our last talk. Derek's been making the rounds again, but this time he's not offering to buy. He's threatening. Elena's voice carried the steel of a woman who'd taught middle school for 30 years. He told the Hendersons that property values were going to crater if certain problematic residents didn't adapt to community standards. Made it sound like a friendly warning, but the threat was clear as mountain stream water. That's when I realized Brenda and Derek had escalated beyond harassment into what the military calls active measures, systematic intimidation designed to force compliance through fear. But they'd picked the wrong valley to terrorize. By the meeting's end, we had a plan. Elena would document every threatening interaction and file complaints with the sheriff's department. Jim would research Derek's business connections and property purchases. Walt would coordinate 24/7 surveillance of suspicious vehicles. And I would keep doing exactly what I'd been doing, splitting wood, building furniture, and living my life, while my upgraded cameras gathered evidence of every illegal move Derek made. 2 days later, Brenda filed for a restraining order claiming I'd threatened violence against her person. The petition cited my military background and alleged arsenal of weapons as evidence I was dangerous and unstable. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Most folks would have been intimidated by the legal system bearing down on them. But 20 years of dealing with military bureaucracy had taught me that the best defense against false accusations is overwhelming documentation of the truth. I started preparing my evidence folder. Photographs of the sabotage, cell tower records proving Derek's presence during the break-in attempts, witness statements from 12 neighbors, and my complete military service record showing 20 years of exemplary conduct. Let Brenda play her legal games. I had bigger fish to fry, and Derek Hightower was about to find out that sabotaging a veteran's property was the worst mistake of his privileged life. Brenda's next escalation came on a Tuesday evening while I was in town picking up lumber at Henderson's Hardware. My phone exploded with calls from Walt, Elena, and 3 other neighbors, all asking the same frantic question. "Mac, are you okay? The whole damn cavalry's heading to your place." I could hear sirens wailing in the background as Walt explained. "Brenda called 911 reporting gunshots and screaming from your property. Said she saw smoke and people running around like some kind of firefight was happening. Sheriff's department, fire truck, even the paramedics are racing up your driveway." The taste of instant rage filled my mouth as I gunned my pickup toward home. 20 minutes later, I arrived to find 3 sheriff's vehicles, a fire truck, and an ambulance parked in my driveway like some kind of disaster movie set. Red and blue lights strobed against the pine trees while diesel exhaust mixed with the evening mountain air. Deputy Rodriguez met me at my gate looking embarrassed as hell. "Mac, we got a call about gunshots and possible injuries. Mind if we take a look around?" I handed him my receipt from Henderson's Hardware, time-stamped 43 minutes earlier. "I've been in town buying 2x4s, Deputy. Store's got security cameras if you need confirmation." We walked my property together while his radio crackled with frustrated voices. No bullet holes, no blood, no evidence of any disturbance whatsoever. The only smoke was the faint scent of my wood stove's pilot light, and the only people running were probably deer spooked by all the sirens. "This is the 3rd false report in 6 weeks, Rodriguez said quietly as the fire truck rumbled away. "Always the same complainant, always completely bogus. Just wanted you to know we're keeping track." His warning carried weight. In my Air Force days, I'd seen plenty of situations where legitimate emergencies got ignored because someone cried wolf too many times. Brenda was burning through her credibility faster than kindling in a campfire. But she wasn't done yet. The next morning, Brenda contacted Jake Morrison at the Valley Tribune with a story about a dangerous mountain man threatening our peaceful community. The article made me sound like some kind of survivalist lunatic with PTSD, hoarding weapons and terrorizing innocent families who'd moved here for mountain tranquility. Local HOA President Brenda Hightower expressed concern about Marcus Thornfield, whose military background and isolated lifestyle have raised red flags among newer residents. "We're just trying to protect our families," Hightower told the Tribune. "This man has extensive weapons training and clearly resents anyone who doesn't fit his idea of mountain living." The article included a photo of my cabin taken with a telephoto lens, making my modest home look like some kind of fortress. They'd even managed to get a shot of my gun safe through a window, which they described as an arsenal visible from outside the residence. I was reading this character assassination over morning coffee when Elena knocked on my door with a shit-eating grin and a folder full of papers. "You're going to love this," she said, settling into my kitchen chair. "Remember how I used to work at the county assessor's office? Well, I still have friends there, and they owe me some favors. She spread Derek's property purchase records across my table like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Mountain Vista Development LLC, Derek's company, had purchased 8 properties in the valley over the past 18 months. But here's where it got interesting. Every single purchase was for way above market value, and every seller had been systematically harassed by the HOA before agreeing to sell. Look at this pattern, Elena said, pointing to the dates. HOA complaint, 30 days of escalating harassment, then suddenly the owner gets a cash offer they can't refuse. Derek's been playing this game since day 1. Walt appeared at my door like he'd been summoned by the smell of scandal. Gets better, he said, producing his own folder. Talked to my buddy Jim at the courthouse yesterday. Derek's been requesting mining surveys and water rights documents for the entire valley. Not just recent stuff, historical records going back to the 1800s. And the pieces clicked together like a puzzle solving itself. Derek wasn't just buying properties for a development scheme. He was researching something bigger, something that required intimate knowledge of old land grants and mineral rights. That's when my phone rang with the call that changed everything. Mr. Thornfield, this is Rebecca Owen from First Mountain Bank. I'm calling about the safety deposit box you inherited from your aunt's estate 3 years ago. Our records show you've never accessed it, and we're required to notify you before our next audit. I'd completely forgotten about Aunt Martha's safety deposit box. She'd been my great-aunt on my mother's side, a woman I'd met maybe twice at family reunions. When she died, her lawyer had mentioned some personal effects and documents I'd inherited, but I'd been too busy dealing with Sarah's medical bills to pay attention. I'll be in tomorrow morning to access it, I told Rebecca, something stirring in my gut like a premonition. Meanwhile, Brenda's newspaper article was backfiring spectacularly. By afternoon, 15 neighbors had signed a statement supporting my character. The local VFW post offered legal assistance. Even the hardware store owner called to say he'd told the Tribune reporter that I was one of the most decent customers he'd ever served. But the real surprise came that evening when Deputy Rodriguez called with unofficial advice. Mac, you need to be extra careful. We ran Derek Hightower's background for this false report investigation and some interesting stuff came up. He's been involved in 3 similar development projects in other rural areas. Each time, longtime residents ended up selling after experiencing what they described as systematic harassment campaigns. The metallic taste of realization filled my mouth as Rodriguez continued. I can't prove anything yet, but this looks like a pattern. These people aren't just annoying neighbors. They're running a con game. After Rodriguez hung up, I sat on my porch listening to evening sounds of the valley I'd grown to love. Somewhere in Aunt Martha's forgotten safety deposit box might be the key to understanding what Derek was really after, and tomorrow morning, I was going to find out. First Mountain Bank smelled like old money and fresh anxiety as I walked through their brass doors the next morning. Rebecca Owen led me to the vault, her heels clicking against polished marble floors that had probably seen a century of mountain families storing their most precious secrets. Aunt Martha's safety deposit box was smaller than I'd expected, just big enough for documents and maybe some family jewelry. The metal lid opened with a soft whisper, revealing a collection of yellowed papers that looked older than the bank itself. Sarah's death certificate and insurance papers sat on top, reminders of bureaucratic grief I'd rather forget. But underneath those modern documents lay something that made my hands tremble. A leather portfolio tied with string, containing papers so old the edges crumbled at my touch. The top document bore an official seal from 1923 and the name Ezra Thornfield written in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown. As I read the archaic legal language, my coffee grew cold and my world shifted on its axis. Grant of mineral and water rights to Ezra Thornfield and his heirs in perpetuity, encompassing all subsurface minerals and water sources within the surveyed boundaries of Whispering Pines Valley, totaling 2,847 acres. The document included a hand-drawn survey map showing the entire valley, with Clearwater Creek marked as primary water source, exclusive rights retained. Every property Derek had purchased, every lot Brenda's HOA claimed to govern, every square foot of Pines Vista estates, all of it sat on land where my great-grandfather had retained the mineral and water rights nearly a century ago. I called Elena from my truck, hands shaking as I held the phone. I need Walt and you at my place immediately. Bring coffee and prepare to have your minds blown. An hour later, we sat around my kitchen table staring at documents that changed everything. Walt, who'd worked for the county his entire career, whistled low as he examined the survey map. Jesus, Mac. This deed predates every land division in the valley. When they subdivided Ezra's original claim in 1962, they only sold surface rights. These mineral and water rights never transferred. Elena traced the creek's path with her finger. That means Derek's resort development would need massive water access for pools, spas, landscaping. Without your water rights, his entire project is worthless, I finished. Every investor he's courted, every loan application he's submitted, every promise he's made about secured resources, it's all built on land he can't actually develop. The beautiful irony hit me like an avalanche of justice. Derek had spent over $2 million purchasing surface rights to properties that couldn't legally support his development plans. Every harassment campaign, every legal threat, every midnight sabotage attempt had been designed to drive me out of the valley so I wouldn't discover what I already owned. Walt leaned back in his chair, a grin spreading across his weathered face. That pompous son of a bitch has been trying to steal water rights he doesn't even know you have. I pulled out my phone and called Morrison Legal Services in town. Mr. Morrison, Mac Thornfield. I need to retain your services for something that's going to make your month very interesting. Attorney Morrison arrived within 2 hours, examined the documents with the hungry expression of a lawyer who'd just found a winning lottery ticket, and confirmed what I already knew. The deed was legitimate, enforceable, and absolutely bulletproof. Mr. Thornfield, he said, adjusting his glasses. You don't just own water rights to Clearwater Creek. You own subsurface mineral rights under every property in this valley. Derek Hightower's company has been selling investors access to resources you control. The sweet taste of pending victory filled my mouth as the full scope of Derek's error became clear. He'd researched historical mining claims, studied water rights law, and methodically purchased valley properties. But he'd missed the one document that mattered most, the original Thornfield deed that trumped every subsequent land sale. Brenda thought she was dealing with a hillbilly who split firewood too loudly. Derek believed he was intimidating a lonely widower who didn't understand property law. They had no idea they'd just declared war on the guy who legally owned the ground beneath their feet. Time to show them what real mountain justice looked like. The War Council convened in my living room that evening with the intensity of generals planning D-Day. Walt brought his surveyor's knowledge and 40 years of county connections. Elena arrived with her teacher's organizational skills and a network that reached every longtime resident in the valley. Attorney Morrison came armed with legal strategy and a predatory gleam in his eyes that suggested he'd been waiting his entire career for a case this satisfying. Here's our objective, I said, spreading the 1923 deed across my coffee table like a battle map. Derek's scheduled his big investor presentation 3 weeks from Friday. He's promising those Silicon Valley money men locked-in water rights and guaranteed environmental approval. We're going to let him make those promises, then destroy his credibility in front of everyone who matters. Morrison adjusted his glasses, already calculating billable hours. The legal foundation is rock solid. I'll file formal water rights claims with the county tomorrow, establish your standing to challenge any development permits, and request mandatory environmental impact reviews. Once that paperwork hits the system, Derek's project stops dead. Elena pulled out a notebook that looked like it could organize a military campaign. I've been tracking Derek's property purchases through my friend at the assessor's office. He's used shell companies to hide the full scope: Mountain Vista Development, Pines Investment LLC, Summit Holdings Corp., all registered to the same address, all buying properties after orchestrated harassment campaigns. Walt leaned forward, his old hands steady as mountains. Been watching them operate for months now. Derek's got a pattern: anonymous complaints to create problems, then cash offers to solve them. He's done it to 6 families already, always the same playbook. That's when I realized we needed more than legal paperwork to stop Derek's operation. We needed to catch him in the act, document his fraud, and expose his systematic deception to both investors and law enforcement. Time for some real reconnaissance. Over the next week, we implemented what I privately called Operation Mountain Justice. Elena infiltrated Brenda's private Facebook group using a fake account, gaining access to their planning discussions and timeline details. The intelligence was pure gold. Derek had promised investors that all regulatory obstacles would be resolved before their site visit, and that water rights were fully secured through strategic property acquisition. Meanwhile, Walt coordinated with Jim Murphy and 5 other longtime residents to document every suspicious vehicle entering the valley. They created a surveillance network that would have made the CIA proud. Retired folks with time on their hands and decades of grudges against entitled outsiders who thought they could buy their way into paradise. My contribution was more technical. I invested in a professional-grade surveillance system that covered not just my property, but strategic viewing points throughout the valley. Hidden cameras monitored Derek's illegal creek access, documented his crew's trespassing activities, and recorded every violation of environmental regulations his operation had committed. The equipment came from a military contractor who specialized in border security. Motion-activated cameras with night vision, cellular upload capability, and GPS tracking that created admissible evidence for court proceedings. For less than $3,000, I'd built a surveillance network that could track Derek's every move without him knowing he was being watched. But the psychological warfare was even more satisfying. I continued playing my role as desperate seller, feeding Derek carefully crafted misinformation about neighbors willing to sell cheap. Every conversation was recorded, every promise documented, every lie preserved for future prosecution. Derek's greed made him sloppy, revealing details about his investor timeline, financing requirements, and the offshore accounts he was using to hide money. The beauty was watching Derek dig his own grave while thinking he was winning. He bragged about neutralizing environmental opposition and eliminating problematic residents, never realizing that every word was being preserved for his eventual criminal trial. Elena's social media campaign proved equally effective. Her Save Whispering Pines Facebook group attracted 300 members in 10 days, including environmental activists, local reporters, and 3 county commissioners who'd been looking for an excuse to investigate Derek's suspicious permitting applications. Meanwhile, Morrison prepared our legal nuclear option: cease and desist letters for Derek's investor presentation, environmental injunctions to halt any construction, and criminal fraud complaints ready for immediate filing. We'd let Derek make his promises to investors, then systematically destroy every claim with documented evidence. The timeline was perfect. Derek's presentation was scheduled for Friday evening at the Pines Vista Clubhouse. Our revelation would come Saturday morning at Brenda's emergency HOA meeting that she'd called to discuss declining property values caused by problematic residents. Walt's nephew Jake, the investigative reporter, would publish his expose in Sunday's regional newspaper, complete with photographs of Derek's illegal activities and recordings of his fraudulent promises. By Monday morning, Derek would face criminal investigations, civil lawsuits, and complete financial ruin. But the most satisfying part was Derek's ignorance. He still believed he was intimidating a lonely widower who didn't understand property law. Right up until Friday evening, he'd be congratulating himself on acquiring another mountain valley for development. He had no idea that the hillbilly he'd been harassing owned the water rights that made his entire project possible, and was about to destroy everything Derek had worked for in front of the investors whose money he'd already spent. Sometimes the best revenge is just letting greedy people reveal their true nature to the wrong audience. With his investor presentation just 2 weeks away, Derek's behavior shifted from calculated harassment to barely controlled panic. The Silicon Valley money men were flying in for site visits. His construction loans required environmental approvals within 30 days, and somehow his foolproof intimidation campaign had failed to drive me out of the valley. So Derek decided to get creative. The bribery attempt came on a Wednesday morning disguised as a neighborly visit. Derek's Tesla crunched up my gravel driveway, its pristine white paint job looking obscene against the backdrop of honest dirt and working man's tools. He climbed out wearing hiking boots that had never seen actual hiking, and a forced smile that wouldn't have fooled a tourist. "Mac, I think we got off on the wrong foot," he said, extending his hand like we were old friends instead of mortal enemies. "I'd like to make things right between us." I let him sweat for a moment before shaking his soft palm with my calloused fingers. "What did you have in mind, Derek?" "Well, I know Brenda can be a little intense about community standards, and I realize your property has sentimental value." He paused, pulling out an envelope thick enough to choke a horse. "I'm prepared to offer $500,000 cash for your land. No inspection, no contingencies. Close in 2 weeks." The crisp scent of fresh bills mixed with Derek's nervous sweat as he fanned out $100 bills like some kind of drug dealer making a buy. 500 grand was more than triple what I'd paid for the property, enough to buy a mansion anywhere in the state. That's generous, I said, playing my role perfectly. But this place means everything to me. Sarah and I plan to grow old here. Derek's mask slipped just enough to reveal the predator underneath. Mac, let me be completely honest. This valley's changing whether you like it or not. You can either profit from that change, or you can get crushed by it. There are ways to make life very difficult for people who don't adapt. The metallic taste of pure rage filled my mouth, but I kept my voice level. Is that a threat, Derek? It's just reality. Sometimes accidents happen to stubborn people. Equipment failures, permit problems, tax audits. Life gets complicated when you fight progress. Every word was being recorded by the micro-recorder Elena had helped me wire into my shirt pocket. Derek's casual mention of accidents was enough to add witness intimidation charges to his growing list of crimes. But Derek's desperation manifested in ways beyond bribery. Over the next week, my surveillance cameras captured a systematic sabotage campaign that escalated beyond amateur hour tire slashing. Someone contaminated my well water by dumping motor oil down the wellhead, an environmental crime that could have poisoned the entire valley's groundwater. My solar panel array suffered accidental damage from a falling tree branch that showed clear saw marks where it had been cut. Phone lines to my cabin were severed 3 different times, always during hours when Derek's crew was documented in the area. The community intimidation campaign spread beyond my property. Derek's associates, 2 guys in expensive suits who looked like they'd watched too many mob movies, visited Elena and Walt with offers to buy their properties at inflated prices. When both refused, the conversations turned ugly. Elena recorded her encounter on her phone. Mr. Derek suggested our property taxes might face extra scrutiny if we continued obstructing community improvement efforts. He mentioned that elderly residents sometimes struggle with complex tax situations. Walt's visit was more direct. Those city boys implied that my old pickup truck might have mechanical problems if I kept interfering with their business operations. Even mentioned that rural accidents sometimes take a while for emergency services to reach. But Derek's biggest mistake was underestimating the solidarity of mountain communities. Instead of terrorizing residents into submission, his threats triggered a defensive response that would have made the Minutemen proud. Walt organized 24/7 neighborhood watch rotations. Elena created encrypted communication channels between resistant residents. Jim Murphy started documenting every Derek sighting with GPS coordinates and timestamps. My surveillance network captured it all. Derek's crew illegally tapping Clearwater Creek to test water flow rates, surveyors trespassing on private property to gather soil samples, and most damning of all, Derek himself directing his men to make life miserable for anyone who won't sell. The water theft was particularly egregious. Derek had installed an illegal pump upstream from the main valley settlement, diverting enough water to drop everyone's well levels during the dry season. Elena's vegetable garden withered when her irrigation water turned brackish from contamination. Walt's livestock pond dropped 3 feet in 2 weeks. But instead of driving us out, Derek's escalation was creating the evidence we'd need to destroy him. Every illegal act was documented, every threat recorded, every environmental violation photographed with legal precision. Meanwhile, Brenda filed her restraining order petition, painting me as a dangerous veteran with PTSD who'd threatened violence against innocent families. The hearing was scheduled for Monday, the day after Derek's investor presentation. As I prepared my evidence folders and witness statements, I couldn't help but smile. Derek thought he was closing in for the kill, pressuring a desperate man into submission through superior resources and ruthless tactics. He had no idea he was about to face the worst week of his privileged life. Derek's meltdown began the moment I showed him the 1923 deed during our final negotiation meeting. I'd invited him to my cabin under the pretense of accepting his cash offer, but with Elena and Walt hidden in my basement recording everything through hidden microphones, the real purpose was gathering evidence for his inevitable prosecution. "This is impossible," Derek sputtered, his face turning the color of overripe tomatoes as he stared at Ezra Thornfield's water rights documentation. "I researched every mineral claim, every historical survey, every property transfer in this valley. There's no way some backwoods ancestor of yours owns subsurface rights to the entire development." I poured myself coffee with the calm satisfaction of a man who'd just played his winning hand. Derek, you researched everything except the one document that actually matters. My great-grandfather retained mineral and water rights when the original claim was subdivided in 1962. Every property purchase you've made only included surface rights. The sweet smell of fresh mountain coffee mixed with Derek's panicked perspiration as reality crashed over him like an avalanche. $2.5 million in property purchases, 18 months of systematic harassment, countless promises to investors about secured water access. All of it worthless without the water rights I'd inherited and forgotten about until his scheme forced me to dig deeper. "You're lying," Derek said, his voice cracking like a teenager asking for his first date. "This deed is probably forged. I'll have my lawyers prove it's fraudulent." "Go ahead," I replied, sliding certified copies across my kitchen table. "These documents are archived in 3 different locations, validated by the State Historical Society and confirmed by 2 independent land attorneys. Your lawyers can examine them all they want." That's when Derek revealed just how desperate he'd become. He tried to snatch the documents off my table, as if destroying copies could somehow erase the original deed. When I calmly moved the papers out of reach, he threatened everything from lawsuits to physical violence. "You mountain people don't understand what you're dealing with," Derek hissed, his mask of civility completely shredded. "I have investors who've committed $15 million based on my guarantees. If this project fails because of your bullshit claims, I'll make sure you never have a peaceful moment for the rest of your life." Every threat was being recorded in high-definition audio, adding witness intimidation and criminal coercion to Derek's growing legal troubles. But his desperation drove him to even stupider decisions. The next morning, Brenda filed an emergency injunction claiming my water rights assertion was a fraudulent extortion scheme designed to interfere with legitimate business operations. She demanded the county freeze all property transactions pending investigation, and suggested I was mentally unstable due to combat-related trauma and social isolation. The legal filing was a masterpiece of projection and desperation, accusing me of exactly what Derek had been doing to Valley residents for the past year. But Judge Martinez had seen enough frivolous HOA complaints to recognize tactical litigation when it landed on her desk. Meanwhile, Derek launched a character assassination campaign that would have made Joseph McCarthy proud. He contacted Jake Morrison at the Valley Tribune, claiming I was extorting legitimate developers through fraudulent historical documents. He hired a private investigator to dig through my military records looking for anything that might suggest mental instability or violent tendencies. Most damaging of all, Derek began spreading rumors through Brenda's social network that I was a dangerous isolationist who'd been stockpiling weapons and making threats against families with children. The Whisper campaign was designed to turn community sentiment against me before the truth about his fraud could spread. But Derek's smear tactics backfired spectacularly. Elena's counterintelligence network had infiltrated every communication channel Brenda and Derek were using. Within hours of Derek's lies being spread, Elena was circulating documented evidence of his bribery attempts, environmental crimes, and systematic harassment of elderly residents. The community response was swift and decisive. Walt organized a public meeting where 12 neighbors testified about Derek's intimidation tactics. Elena presented photographs of Derek's illegal water diversion and contaminated wells. Jim Murphy displayed property purchase records showing Derek's pattern of harassment then acquisition across multiple rural communities. By Thursday evening, Derek was facing criminal complaints for environmental destruction, civil lawsuits for fraud and intimidation, and complete community ostracism. His carefully constructed image as a visionary developer bringing prosperity to rural areas had collapsed into the reality of a predatory swindler who targeted vulnerable communities. But the real blow came when Derek's Silicon Valley investors started asking uncomfortable questions. Elena's social media campaign had reached environmental groups who contacted Derek's financial backers directly. Suddenly, wealthy tech executives were receiving detailed documentation of Derek's illegal activities from organizations with armies of lawyers and political connections. The final straw was Derek's pathetic attempt to forge competing water rights documents. My surveillance cameras caught his crew trying to age newly printed papers with coffee stains and sandpaper, creating historical documents that would support Derek's false claims to water access. Computer forensic analysis proved the fake documents were created on Derek's office printer using modern paper and toner. Instead of supporting his position, Derek's forgery attempt added federal fraud charges to his legal troubles. As Friday's investor presentation approached, Derek was trapped in a web of his own making. Criminal investigations pending, civil litigation mounting, community opposition organized, and no legal path forward for his development project. He'd cornered himself, and tomorrow night I was going to finish the job. Friday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of mountain justice finally coming home to roost. The Pines Vista clubhouse buzzed with nervous energy as Derek's Silicon Valley investors arrived in rental cars that probably cost more than most Valley residents made in 6 months. 12 tech executives in expensive casual wear, all clutching financial portfolios and wearing the confident expressions of men accustomed to turning rural land into profit margins. Derek had transformed the clubhouse into a presentation theater, complete with projector screens showing architectural renderings of Whispering Pines Luxury Resort and Spa. The development plans promised a $47 million paradise, boutique hotel suites, championship golf course, world-class spa facilities, and exclusive access to pristine mountain wilderness. I slipped into the back row with Walt, Elena, and Attorney Morrison, my phone recording everything while Derek's presentation began. The smell of expensive coffee and nervous sweat filled the room as Derek launched into his pitch. "Gentlemen, you're looking at the last undeveloped luxury destination within 2 hours of Denver," Derek said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a man who'd sold this dream to investors 3 times before. Whispering Pines represents a unique opportunity to create an exclusive retreat that will generate premium returns for decades. He clicked through financial projections showing 15% annual returns, occupancy rates guaranteed by strategic partnerships with luxury travel companies, and construction timelines that promised grand opening within 18 months. Every slide reinforced his central promise. This was a sure thing, a risk-free investment backed by comprehensive due diligence and secured resource access. "Our water rights are fully secured through strategic property acquisition," Derek announced, displaying a map that showed his property purchases throughout the valley. "Environmental approvals are proceeding on schedule, and we've successfully addressed all community concerns through our local HOA partnership." That's when I stood up. "Derek, before your investors sign anything, there's something they should know about those water rights you just guaranteed." The room fell silent except for the projector's electronic hum. Derek's face went pale as mountain snow as he realized his carefully orchestrated presentation was about to become a public execution. "This is a private meeting, Thornfield. You're trespassing." "Actually, you invited me here to discuss selling my water rights," I replied calmly, pulling out my phone to display the 1923 deed. "I thought your investors should see what they're really buying into." I walked to the front of the room while Derek sputtered protests. Attorney Morrison distributed copies of the Thornfield deed to every investor, his movements precise as a funeral director arranging a burial. "Gentlemen, this document grants my family exclusive water rights to every square foot of this valley," I announced, my voice carrying the authority of 20 years military service. "Derek's resort can't legally operate without access to Clearwater Creek, water rights he doesn't own and can't obtain." The lead investor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who'd been nodding along with Derek's presentation, examined the deed with growing alarm. "Mr. Hightower, is this document legitimate?" Derek's desperation transformed him from smooth salesman to cornered animal. "It's obviously a forgery. This mountain man is trying to extort money from legitimate developers." That's when Morrison stepped forward with the kill shot. Mr. Derek claimed his documents were fraudulent, so he had them independently verified. He produced certified validation letters from the State Historical Society, 2 law firms, and the county clerk's office. These water rights are absolutely legitimate and legally enforceable. But the real devastation came when Morrison played audio recordings of Derek's bribery attempts, environmental crimes, and threats against Valley residents. The investors' confident expressions melted into horror as they heard Derek instructing his crew to contaminate that hillbilly's well and promising that accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. "Jesus Christ," the lead investor whispered, closing his portfolio with the finality of a coffin lid. "Derek, did you know about this fraud when you took our funding?" Derek's meltdown was spectacular and complete. He accused me of conspiracy to destroy legitimate business, blamed his investors for not understanding rural development challenges, and threatened everyone present with lawsuits that would bankrupt this entire backwater community. His rant continued until Walt stood up with the quiet authority of a man who'd seen plenty of city bullies come and go. "Son, You've been caught red-handed defrauding these people and terrorizing our community. Time to shut your mouth and accept the consequences." The investors fled like tourists escaping an avalanche, their $15 million in funding evaporating faster than morning mist. Derek stormed out promising revenge, while Brenda sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that her HOA presidency had just become worthless as Confederate money. The next morning, our community meeting packed the Valley Center with 85 people, 3 reporters, and county officials who'd driven up specifically to witness Derek's public destruction. Jake Morrison's live stream attracted 2,000 viewers as I presented the complete timeline of Derek's fraud scheme. By Sunday, Derek faced federal criminal charges, civil lawsuits totaling $23 million, and bankruptcy proceedings that would strip him of everything he'd stolen from rural communities across 3 states. Mountain justice had finally come home to roost. 6 months later, Whispering Pines Valley had transformed into something Sarah would have loved. A genuine community bound by shared values instead of HOA regulations and property values. Derek Hightower was serving 3 years in federal prison for wire fraud, environmental crimes, and witness intimidation. The FBI's investigation had uncovered his systematic targeting of rural communities across Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming, where he'd used identical tactics to defraud investors and terrorize longtime residents. His asset forfeiture settlement provided restitution to dozens of families he'd harmed, while his development company became a cautionary tale studied in business ethics classes. Brenda had fled back to San Francisco the week after Derek's arrest, filing for divorce and leaving their glass monstrosity to foreclosure proceedings. The house sold for half its original price to a retired park ranger, and his wife, who immediately installed wooden shutters and a stone chimney that actually looked like it belonged in the mountains. But the real victory was what I did with my newfound power as the Valley's water rights owner. Instead of selling those rights for millions to some other development company, I established the Clearwater Creek Conservation Trust. The trust granted every Valley resident permanent water access at cost, while protecting our creek from commercial exploitation forever. Environmental groups called it a model for private conservation that other communities could replicate. The paperwork that created the trust was simple enough. As long as water flowed through Whispering Pines Valley, it would remain available to residents, wildlife, and the ecosystem that made our mountains special. No corporation could ever again threaten our community with water scarcity or price manipulation. My woodworking business exploded after the national media attention. Orders for custom mountain furniture were backlogged 8 months, with waiting lists that included celebrities who'd read about the mountain man who defeated Silicon Valley developers. The irony was perfect. Derek's attempt to destroy my simple life had created more success than I'd ever imagined possible. But the best part was watching our community heal from Derek's divisive tactics. Walt Kowalski was elected president of our new resident council, which focused on mutual aid instead of property restrictions. Elena Santos organized monthly potluck dinners where neighbors shared tools, knowledge, and friendship instead of HOA complaints. Even some of Derek's former supporters joined our gatherings once they realized cooperation worked better than competition. We established the Sarah Thornfield Memorial Scholarship for rural students pursuing environmental studies, funded by licensing our conservation story to documentary filmmakers and ecotourism companies. The first recipient was Elena's granddaughter, Maria, who'd been inspired by our water rights battle to study environmental law. The annual Whispering Pines Folk Festival became a celebration of everything Derek had tried to eliminate: rural culture, environmental stewardship, and community resilience. 500 visitors attended our first year, all proceeds supporting local families and volunteer fire department equipment. My custom furniture raffle alone raised $15,000 for medical emergencies and equipment repairs. These days, I still split firewood every morning at 7 sharp, but now the sound echoes across a valley where neighbors wave instead of calling the cops. My chainsaw has become a morning alarm clock that people actually appreciate, signaling another day in a community that chose cooperation over conflict. The best part happens every evening when I sit on my porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Rosa Santos, Elena's sister and a widow who understands the weight of loss, often joins me with coffee and conversation that flows as naturally as Clearwater Creek. We're taking things slow, 2 people who've learned that the best relationships grow like mountain pines, strong roots, patient growth, and deep enough foundation to weather any storm. My cabin still overlooks the entire valley, but now I see neighbors tending gardens instead of plotting harassment campaigns. Children play in the creek that Derek tried to steal, their laughter mixing with evening sounds of a healthy ecosystem. Wood smoke rises from chimneys throughout our community, carrying the scent of home fires tended by people who chose to stay and build something lasting. Sometimes the best revenge is simply outlasting the bastards who try to destroy your peace. Speaking of bastards and their schemes, drop a comment sharing your worst HOA or neighbor nightmare. Let's support each other against entitled jerks who think money gives them power over communities. And hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about regular folks beating corrupt systems. Trust me, I've got plenty more where this came from, and next week's story will blow your mind. How a retired librarian used a 200-year-old land grant to shut down a pipeline company and make the governor personally apologize to her.